Visual contrast is an attribute that can be influenced by qualities that are easy to miss. What I'm talking about here are the more subtle secondary qualities of visual form. Line, texture, direction, and movement all influence the relative degrees of visual contrast in a piece of design. Remember that in a fundamental sense, visual contrast is about the comparison of things that are unlike, different, or opposite. Let's do a quick rundown of all four terms. Line, or more specifically, line weight, is an easily overlooked way of manipulating visual contrast. The thickness of a line can determine quite a bit of how contrast is read in an image or piece of design. Texture can be thought of as a visual simulation or imitation of the sense of touch or other senses. Texture visually defines a surface in a way that refers to how the surface might feel. Although touch and real tactile qualities are important in graphic design when it comes to paper stock and printing, we are talking about texture here specifically as a visual quality. Direction refers to the visual weight and concentration of a composition. A centered composition, balanced vertically and horizontally, has almost no movement and evokes stability. An unbalanced, asymmetrical composition that leans diagonally across the page seems more dynamic and unstable. Movement is a visual quality somewhat analogous to texture that imitates or simulates movement in a piece of design without actually moving. This can be a bit complicated, since graphic design does encompass motion graphics and user interface design, both of which include graphic elements that do in fact move. At the same time, all kinds of graphic design use static elements to imply movement. Compositions that have a strong sense of movement also have a strong direction that is usually dynamic and not balanced. These four qualities create contrast using more subtle means that can still have big effects. Let's look at line and line weight first. The relative thickness of lines is a remarkably effective and simple technique to make contrasts between visual elements in a piece of design. As you can see in this first example, a poster for a lecture by the pop music critic Simon Reynolds, there is a highly effective use of letters and lines with different weights. The designer for the poster references analog and digital displays on stereo and audio equipment. You can think of type, whether it is in individual letters or complete words, as graphic elements composed of lines. If we examine the poster more closely, the three letter O's can be seen to have different line weights. The letter O's obviously differ in size, but it is also the thickness of the line that makes the O that also creates contrast. This creates a subtle range of contrast between the capital R in Reynolds and the thin lines that lie diagonally across the poster. Although this poster has a very considered approach to color, it is a contrast created by lines and line weight that creates visual interest. Now let's do an exercise with the Simon Reynolds poster. If you remove color and look at the poster in black and white, does it affect how you see line weight? As noted before, texture can be thought of as a kind of visual simulation of tactile or other sensory qualities. You can't, in most cases, literally feel a poster, but a designer can use visual texture to create effects that remind the viewer of a rough, smooth, or grainy surface texture. In this poster, visual texture is being used to simulate sound. This poster was designed for an artist, a sculptor who uses sound in her art. Although sound has few direct visual qualities, the designers use these radial patterns of dots and dashes to create an image where the artist's first name, Susan, floats around other radial patterns. This use of visual texture drives the entire poster. As you can see in this close-up, this dot and dash texture is used to create contrast between the letters of the artist's name and the background elements. The use of texture is used in a very distinctive way, implying that words are being sculpted out of thin air with sound. Direction is a powerful tool to create visual contrast in a piece of graphic design. When I say direction, I'm referring to the visual weight and concentration of composition. In this poster, which in one sense is very dynamic and jarring because of the use of graphic elements that look like lightning bolts, it is also very stable and static. The friction between the dynamic and the static is what gives it visual intensity and draws our eye to it. So why does this poster feel static and stable? The key here is all the visual weight of the poster pulls inward towards the center. This poster is symmetrical in two dimensions. The left and right side generally mirror each other, as well as the top and the bottom. This makes the poster seem locked into place as a composition. The visual weight seems equal on all sides, pulling towards the center. This poster has a clear direction, but it also has almost no sense of movement. In contrast, this poster has a clear sense of direction and movement. Designed for a lecture by designer Alan Horry, this poster functions in a very different way than the last one. The direction is clearly more horizontal and moves left to right. The graphic elements that are part digital and part hand-drawn create a very strong horizontal axis. There is no clear symmetry in the composition of the poster, and as a kind of bonus, there's a secondary direction here that adds to the complexity of the design. These lines of type that appear to be falling apart, letters raining down into a white void, creates another kind of visual weight by subtraction. There are a few elements here, but the huge amount of white space in the sense of falling lends a clear directionality to the bottom of the poster. In this case, direction is shaped by the contrast formed from the enormous white space and the tiny letters that appear to be tumbling into space. Movement in a general sense is the use of static elements to imply motion. This last poster is an excellent example of how a two-dimensional static piece of graphic design can imitate or simulate movement without actually moving. This poster uses line weight and direction exceptionally well to create the feel of a horizontal motion across the poster. Since this poster advertises a piano concert, there was an obvious effort to allude to the black and white keys of a piano keyboard. Again, there is the idea of using graphic elements to emulate music and sound. The alternation of thick and thin lines across the poster creates a kind of visual rhythm that spreads across the page. These close-ups of details of the poster emphasize this effect. You can think of movement as the effect caused by the successful combination of other techniques, in this case line weight and direction. Movement is shaped by the effective use of visual contrast. It is less a kind of visual contrast than an indication that visual contrast has been successfully deployed and executed. Now let's do an exercise. Take a look at this poster. Does it use one of the 4 qualities outlined in this video, line, texture, direction, and movement, in an outstanding way? Why?